always like summarizing and coming back, and because it's reinforcing what we've already done in the light of what comes from earlier and then what also comes later. And this is why I said Augustine was so important, though, because I think he really looks at the issue in a way that we can follow, and it gives us fertile ground for proceeding, both in terms of how we learn and then also how we teach. But in post-structuralism, so it's on page 111 here, Eagleton summarized what he said about structuralism, referring to Ferdinand de Saussure, who argues that meaning in language is just a matter of difference. That's all that meaning is. It's just difference. So a cat is cat because it's not a cap. There's a cat, it's not a cap. And it's not a bat. So the first letter or the last letter could be changed, and it's just difference. That's what language is. Post-structuralism is a little different, and I'm going to read his summary here. The process we are discussing is not only in theory infinite, but somehow circular, because signifiers keep transforming into signifieds and vice versa, and you will never arrive at a final signified which is not a signifier in itself, because you keep on. The signifiers you designate are different from other words like cap and cat and bat and car and can and pan and all these little differentiations, and then you can change the A as well. These are just differences, and that's how language develops, yes. And there's an endless play of these signifiers, an infinite array seemingly, and it just doesn't stop, and so it's not particularly meaningful. But Eagleton summarizes, says, if structuralism divide the sign from the referent, this kind of thinking, often known as post-structuralism, goes a step further. It divides the signifier from the signified. And then I'll just read what he says here, and then I'll comment. Another way of putting what we have just said is that meaning is not immediately present in a sign. Since the meaning of a sign is a matter of what the sign is not, because it's only negation. That's what the process of structuralism is. A can is not a cat. It's by negation. A can is this because it's not that. It's not referring to a can, it's referring to a not cat. So it's a process of negation, differentiation, but not of unification. There's never, going back to the laws of logic, there's never identification. First law of logic is law of identity. Second is law of non-contradiction. So, and law of non-contradiction is differentiation, but not predicated on identification to begin with. There's no identification in Saussure's linguistic enterprise. You never identify something. The language refers to itself, or the words refer to other words or differentiate themselves from this. But now it goes further, and they divide the signifier from the signified. And another way of putting that is that there's no meaning in the sign. It's not present in the sign, rather. And this is why people often say that this form of language is a lot like the medieval conflict of nominalism as opposed to realism. It's just referring to something but not the essence of the thing. So in, say, take, eat, this is my body, what does the word is mean here? It symbolizes it, or it is it? What does the word is mean? You might think it's clear what it means, but it isn't clear what it means. It could be taken to be both ways. Well, the nominalists say that our words always refer to certain things as empirical objects, but never as the universal within the particular there. Whereas when we say this is the body of Christ, from a realist perspective, you're going to say that the universal, that is Christ, is in the bread. And then you can even say, well, what do you mean by in the bread even? There's a lot. Again, we talked about that. We don't need to reiterate that. But it's far more complicated than you might think. Or maybe it isn't, but it becomes complicated. There's a lot of discussion about exactly what is meant by is and what is in and what is bread. And every word there can be disputed. But here, this approach is problematized for all uses of language, not just for the Lord's Supper, not just for the Eucharist, but all uses of language. And since the meaning of a sign is a matter of what the sign is not, the meaning is always in some sense absent from it as well. So what it means is deferred. And because of that, we have the crisis of meaning in our day. So literary theory seems very abstract, irrelevant. I have a small class here. It's a fourth year. Almost every class in this university has more students in its fourth year than this class. Because it seems so abstract, so uninteresting in some ways. And it is abstract. I don't think it's uninteresting, but it does seem rather remote from practical implications. But there is no more practical class in the whole university than this one, because everything is predicated on what's happening in this class. And I don't mean that as a good thing. It's because the consequence of what is said in literary theory has spilled over into all areas of knowledge. It's not a good thing, but it is a thing. So meaning, and now going back to him, meaning, if you like, is scattered or dispersed along the whole chain of signifiers. It cannot easily be nailed down. It is never fully present in any one sign alone, but is rather a kind of constant flickering of presence and absence together. Reading a text is more like tracing this process of constant flickering than it is like counting the beads on a necklace. So, and Derrida, when we talked about his deconstructive method, was talking about exactly that. When Plato wants to talk about being, he always falls short. There's a problem of identifying what being is. Even though the whole logocentric tradition is predicated on that, Derrida says that it is phonocentric. It's dependent on what the intent is, rather than the written word. And he proposes to flip it around, like a Kantian turn or a Copernican turn. Let's focus on the letter rather than on the spirit. You'll note that this interplay keeps on going back and forth, the word versus the spirit. And I do think it's a helpful way of looking at it. And for me, this is one of the reasons I came to faith, actually, is I recognized that the spirit can't be understood except through the letter. That revelation is necessary, because otherwise it's just intention, and intention is infinitely divisible and has no actual meaning. That's common. That's logical, per se. And contemporary lit theory plays on that infinitely. And I found that infinitely problematic. But he goes on, Eagleton. There's also another sense in which we can never quite close our fists over meaning, which arises from the fact that language is a temporal process. Yes, this is what I talked about earlier. So Kant did not see temporality as a problem. It was just one of the conditions of understanding, but it wasn't a problem. But he didn't conceive it in terms of existence, he conceived it in terms of being. Right? It was from an abstract universal perspective where there's no prejudice, no particularity. It's a condition of human knowing, yes, because we're finite beings. And finitude is, of course, one of the conditions here. But the perspective is infinite, seemingly, insofar as it's not contradicted by finitude. At least that's the perspective Kant wants to get. And it's, as I said, the view from nowhere, as Thomas Nagel describes it. But the post-structuralists point out that language is a temporal process. That's Heidegger's emphasis as well. It's temporality. It's not time, it's temporality. Augustine talks about time. Very important chapter, Confessions, Book 11. He talks about time as opposed to as one of the ways in which we see things, but also God's is outside of that. Very important, interesting, and very interesting discussion. I don't even know if it's talked about in this university. It ought to be. This is such an important topic, and Augustine introduces it. But here we're not talking about time, we're talking about temporality. And when we say temporality, we mean existence as opposed to being. And something that's limited, and something that, furthermore, to go back to what I said at the beginning, is something that we don't have in common, other than that we're subject to temporality, but we don't have the same temporality, because I grew up in a very different place than you did. Even if I grew up in your house, I don't occupy the same bodily space that you do. I am not you. Romantic hermeneutics says that I can know as well as, if not better than you do, because I can occupy that space in your mind by thinking the thoughts that you think, and also knowing the cultural conditions under which you operated that you couldn't abstract yourself from. And so I can relativize the statements of previous writers and see the difference and understand better than you do. But you understand the process of learning was occupying the mental space of the writer. Right? What was Shakespeare thinking when he wrote this? We asked that question. Right? What was he thinking? We don't ask, what does Shakespeare write? Say, what was he thinking? And the one might be the answer to the other, but it's not necessarily the answer to the other. It might be, well, actually he wrote this, but what he wrote there is not what he was trying to do. He was trying to do something else, and you'll note that the contemporary literary critics will always talk about what he was trying to do as opposed to what he did. So they won't refer to the text, they'll refer to the conditions of writing his Shakespearean plays as a way of helping us understand it, yes, but also as a way of mitigating against what he actually wrote. They don't want you to conclude what he's written, they want you to think that he was writing as a product of his own age, and in that sense, Shakespeare is no better than the writing of one of his contemporaries that is not even writing literature. It's just the product of an age, right? So that it's a way of getting rid of the specifically literary, which we've talked about already. So it's a temporal process. When I read a sentence, the meaning of it is always somehow suspended, something deferred or still to come. One signifier relays me to another, and that to another. Earlier meanings are modified by later ones, and although the sentence may come to an end, the process of language itself does not. There is always more meaning where that came from. There's never a meaning. Meaning is a process. It evolves out of and it's sort of an existential act. You're in, and the meaning is as the meaning does. But there's no, what does the text mean? That's the wrong question. In fact, they don't say it's the wrong question. That's an impossible question to answer. It has no meaning. What does it mean to you? The teacher will push it back on you. And whatever you answer, that is the meaning. They'll say, okay, yes, I hear what you're saying. Yes, all right. I mean, it always drove me crazy. But it's not crazy if you come at it from the perspective of post-structuralism. Meaning is something subjectively experienced that cannot be shared with others. And then they will also say that is, from the reception side, that's true. Everyone perceives things differently. But they'll also say, even from the textual side, then, we ought to be reading texts that reflect the same differentiation in the population there in ancient texts. So we ought to be reading more women authors, more queer authors, more whatever, more non-Western authors, because it will reflect that superfluity of meaning. Because meaning is not anything common to humanity. I say the effect of this is meaninglessness in the schools. Most schools these days, I defer to what C.S. Lewis says this in The Abolition of Man. He says that he doesn't encounter weeds in the classroom. They're not bad. The kids aren't bad. It's that there's nothing there. It's like a desert, not a jungle, a desert. They need to be irrigated. They've never been acquainted with meaningfulness in life. Everything around them is meaningless. It's something you do, like you go to school. And why do I go to school? Well, to get a job, right? Which is a terrible answer, but it's a pragmatic one. So in other words, you're saying that the philosophy of life is pragmatism, in which case it's utility, but what if I find it more useful, rather than learning things, just to go and get what I want, rather than work for it? Why wouldn't I do that if it's just utility that's the criteria? Because that's what you're saying. Education is there to get you a job. Well then, I can get a job without the education and without the debt that comes with it. Why wouldn't I do that? Good question. Why wouldn't you do that? You should do that, in fact, if that's all that education is. And I don't think that's true that that is the case, but that's the answer you're given. And the children who are in the schools that are hearing the philosophy of pragmatism pushed at them lose motivation for learning because it's meaningless. And furthermore, it seems like it's becoming more and more obsolete as time goes by, because as technology develops and society develops and allegedly gets better and better, the knowledge from yesterday is no longer valid today. So everything that I'm learning has just become obsolete, and so then they start purging the libraries of older books, and they'll only put in them books written in the last 10 years. I don't know why it's 10 years. Probably because it would be embarrassing if it were only 5 years. You have to have something to fill the shelves. We don't want to demonstrate that we've actually just got rid of everything, which is what has happened. But we don't want to we want to show that off, that we actually have a small number of books on the shelf. But effectively, that's the form of knowing that we're encountering here. And it's meaningless. And so people, what do? They lose themselves in porn addictions, in drug addictions, and they take their own lives. They question whether they exist. Cutting behavior, there's, all that sort of stuff. Meaninglessness. That comes directly out of the academy. It's direct, and it comes directly from this idea that meaning is always endlessly deferred, and although a sentence might come to an end, the process of language never does. And meaning is infinitely deferred to the future. Not even the present, the future. And that future never comes. It's like a glass of water that you see, and every time you move towards it, the glass of water moves away from you, and you never get it. There's always more meaning where that came from. I do not grasp the sense of the sentence just by mechanically piling one word on the other. For the words to compose some relatively coherent meaning at all, each one of them must, so to speak, contain the trace of the ones which have gone before and hold itself open to the trace of those which are coming after. So this is why it's called post-structuralism. It's the consequence of structuralism. Is that it's not just that the words defer themselves, the meaning of the words does as well. And so meaninglessness ensues. And so then meaning is something that is not known or understood. It's something that is done. And you experiment on yourself. And this is where, again, I think modern forms of self-identification arise. You ever thought what a strange phrase that is? What do you identify as? If you'd asked me that 20 years ago, I wouldn't even have understood the question. I mean, what are you asking me? What do you identify as? I would have thought it was a Star Trek question, first of all. I'm an Earthling, or something like that. Greetings, right? What do you identify as? But it's really meant very broadly here, and it's very telling, I think, that it is couched in terms of the self. What do I mean by myself? It's something that I intuit of myself that other people can't access by looking at me. It's like Descartes' cogito. It's the doubting substance that thinks, that will declare what he, she, whatever the terms are, declares of itself. I identify myself. Note how different this language is from the language of Scripture, where actually human beings never identify themselves. They identify other things. It does, by the way, also have this interesting word identity in here, as if human identity were totally predicated on a self-revelation, something that comes from within and can't be seen from without. There's nothing that people can determine about me that I have not revealed to them. So it is a form of revelation, but it's a self-revelation. In Scripture, the only being that refers to himself in this way is God. It's a divine attribute to reveal himself. And how does he do it? Well, he does it in that episode in Exodus, where Moses asks him, Who shall I say sent me? You want me to go and tell the people of Israel, let's get out of Egypt and go to the promised land, and they're not going to listen to me. Who shall I say sent me? And he says, and then the burning bush episodes tell him, I am. Well, this is a pretty cryptic answer. Self-referential. I am that I am, or I shall be what I shall be. As in the second case, you're going to see. It's a future thing. You want to know who I am? You will know who I am when I've delivered you. You will know that I'm the Savior. I'm a deliverer. I'm the Redeemer. So in a sense, it is talking about the being of God, but the being of God is connected to the action of God. Again, that connects with the Hebrew notion of the word as devar, where word means a word, but also an action, something that it happens. The word of God acts. You will know who I am by what I do. Now, that's the only way in which the term self-identification appears in Scripture at all. Adam and Eve are made in the image of God. They don't determine themselves. God determines who they are. They bear his image. And it's impossible to identify yourself, quite frankly. But that is the language that we're encouraged to think in accordance with these days, and then to construct an identity on the basis of that self-identification. And the number of possible identities is infinite. But this is what he means here. I do not grasp the sense of the sense of a sentence just by mechanically piling one word on the other. For the words to compose some relatively coherent meaning at all, each one of them must, so to speak, contain the trace of the ones which have gone before and hold itself open to the trace of those which are coming after. So my self-identification will depend on what I say about myself, and it will be a continually evolving process that will never end. And I will know what it means, but you won't. And legislation now will reinforce that I have to acknowledge that it's your human right, whatever they mean by a human right, when the word human has been evacuated of all generality, right? Because a human right can now refer to an animal as well, and also a computer and a corporation. These can all be persons. They can all be given human rights. So it just begs the very question of what a human right is when human nature is now predicated on self-identification. And this self has no content aside from what is declared by the self. And they will further declare that anyone who names that person, a boy or a girl, is, at birth, has committed an act of aggression. Assigned at birth, they'll say. Assigned by who? By somebody outside the self. Therefore, it's wrong. Each sign of the chain of meaning is somehow scored over or traced through with all the others to form a complex tissue which is never exhaustible, and to this extent, no sign is ever pure or fully meaningful, or intelligible for that matter. But you'll see that this is post-structuralism. If structuralism is true, if the system of Ferdinand de Saussure is the way language works, then post-structuralism necessarily follows. I think this is correct. And because it has been assumed in the academy that the way language works is the way structuralism describes it, we are now rooted in the problem of meaninglessness in Western universities. And he concludes in this rather helpful phrase, meaning, we might say, is thus never identical with itself. So at the end of the day, even meaning doesn't have an identity. Well, why would we call it meaning then? I mean, just language means nothing. And the only thing that will be opposed then is when somebody says, no, that's wrong and that's correct. Because then you're saying that meaning is fixed to something. It does have an identity and it can't be contradicted. That's the thing, and that's the anti-logocentrism aspect of it. It's not just anti-Christ, which I think it fundamentally is, because Christ is the ground of all reality, the revealer of reality, the essence of all reality. It's that even things that are contingent upon him are also gutted of all meaning. It is the process of division or articulation of signs being themselves only because they are not some other sign. So it's a bizarre form of alphabetical determination. It's a sort of materialism, as if words were just some sort of a sound. Derrida pushes against this, but I think it is a problem that the academy itself creates, and then thinks that we're all trapped in the problem, and that we're impossible to think otherwise. And the implication of this is that language is much less stable than even Saussure considered. So there's an endless deferral of meaning. Not only that, not only is my language at risk, and this is the second aspect and the part that I said makes it anti-humanist, so is the person at risk. Because I don't even know that I exist. So the self and the identification is also endlessly deferred. So when we call upon people and demand that they be allowed to identify themselves and that we use their pronouns and so forth, we're begging the question of whether there is actually a self that's doing the determining, and we can't actually conclude that. Right? Because that would be, in essence, that the language, the inability of language to articulate meaning, at least as they posit it, it leaves us in the unenviable position of ever being able to determine what even René Descartes did, that he existed, or that he was, that he's thinking, or that he knows. So on the theory just outlined, nothing is ever fully present in signs. It's an illusion for me to believe that I can never be fully present to you in what I say or write, because to use signs at all entails that my meaning is always somehow dispersed, divided, and never quite at one with itself. Not only my meaning, indeed, but me. I, even me. Since language is something that I am made out of, rather than merely a convenient tool I use, the whole idea that I am a stable, unified entity must also be a fiction. Not only can I never be fully present to you, but I can never be fully present to myself either. Even I am not fully present to myself because I'm using words in my head. Do I exist at all? And although it's articulated in a very postmodern literary form in our day, I will say that this problem was identified in the 18th century even. And I'm trying to think of the name of the book now. I want to take this down. I'm quite sure it's called An Uncommon Sky. And I'm trying to remember the name of the author now. But it's the problem of whether I exist at all. What's the name for this? What is the name for this psychological condition? Wait a second here. I read this book many years ago. It was about 18th century literature. It's called An Uncommon Sky, and it deals with the problem of whether I exist at all and the terror that ensues from it, which Blaise Pascal mentions in his Pensées. I will come to it. Getting Rick Ferris, but this is certainly, it's certainly not that 18th century. Maybe I'm thinking of that, maybe it's not the correct. But the fear that I don't exist at all, which Pascal reflects upon when he reflects on the night sky and the infinite spaces there, and it terrifies him. Agoraphobia. the fear of space, of infinity, that it might entail that I don't exist either, because there's a correspondence between that sense of infinity, which Kant talks about, makes the centerpiece of his aesthetics, and the appeal of the sublime, the essence of the meaning of an absence. Well, maybe I'm the absence that corresponds to that. So the existentialism leads very quickly to nihilism. That arises in the 18th century. I cannot believe I can't find it, and maybe it's not called An Uncommon Sky. I really thought it was. Anyway, I'll come back to you on that next time. I have the book on my shelf. I am quite clear that it's something related to that. But the fact that I am a stable, unified entity must also be a fiction. And then nihilism arises in the mid-20th century as a phenomenon out of the existential movement. And it usually articulates itself as a hatred towards God, because if God exists, then I can't. This is how Sartre frames it. I still need to use signs when I look into my mind or search my soul, and this means that I will never experience any full communion with myself. So there's an absence of myself, and also, as an extension of that, there is no such thing as the author. And so Roland Barthes will write a work, which I think is on the syllabus as well, The Death of the Author. And he's a post-structuralist. And this is exactly what he's arguing. Roland Barthes. And it's the implication of exactly this, the post-structuralist position, is that not only meaning is something that we can't come across, we can't even come across the knowledge of an author ourselves, or even our own authorship. So when I call somebody to self-identify or to appeal to their own authority, they'll find that there's no authority behind their appeal to authority. So they're lost, like in a matrix situation, and that nobody can help them get out of it. So the people that are there to reinforce their sense of trauma, or try and help them out of that sense of themselves, are actually trapping them in a box. Say, well, you find your own way out. I can't. Let me help you. How am I going to help you? Well, I'll use chemicals and surgery, whatever, to give you a sense of yourself that reflects your sense of who you are. And then you do that. And if you do that, does that solve the problem? And the answer is usually no, it doesn't solve the problem. They might be happier with their appearance, but that doesn't solve the problem that was there, that initiated it to begin with, namely that they have no sense of who they are. And the reason they can't is because they're coming at it from the wrong way, from the beginning. That's what you need to be delivered from, not the sense that you feel like you're a man trapped in a woman's body, which is ludicrous. There's no objective basis for this whatsoever. Of course, there can't be, because one excludes the other. If you're this, then you're not that. So if you feel like you are that, the solution is to say you're thinking about this the wrong way. It's not a matter of self-identification, it's a matter of identity. And the identity is something that is given to you. It's not assigned to you. Note the word assignment. Assignment sounds like it's something that is foisted upon you by society, and not something that is given to you by virtue of being a human being. You're either a male or a female. I know there are intersex people and a few individuals that have certain characteristics, but in general, and the two together are made in the image of God, individually and also the two together. So there's something also being importantly said there. But did you have a question, or I've already taken away, or I went where? Okay. So the author is dead according to Roland Barthes, but that even means the self-authoring, self-identifying self is dead. And by using Jordan Peterson's self-authoring software, you're not solving the problem. The fundamental problem of perspective, which is there in literary theory, you're just maybe feeling better about the self that you've authored. It fits more who you think you are, but that who you think you are is not connected to the other people around you still. You're just connected to yourself better. So the therapist has made you happier at being a sick puppy. You're a little happier with the situation. I can be more myself, but you still don't know who you are. And eventually that comes to bite you. So I can never be fully present to you. That's the problem. But also I can never be fully present to myself even. Even my own authority to declare who I am is in question. And I can't solve that question. I'm a riddle to myself. Augustine says exactly this, by the way, in the Confessions. He said, quaestio mihi facto sum. I'm a question to myself. Who am I? I can't answer that question. I'm not the author of my own being. I'm not the captain of my soul, to use the Invictus thing. I am not the author of my own being. I am not the captain of my soul. You made me, God. You reveal this to me. And then he does. So you have to go outside of yourself for your identity. So I still need to use signs when I look to this, but I can't fully commune with myself. And it is not that I can have a pure, unblemished meaning, intention, or experience, which then gets distorted and refracted by the flawed medium of language, because language is the very air I breathe. I can never have a pure, unblemished meaning or experience at all. One way in which I might persuade myself that it is possible is by listening to my own voice when I speak, rather than writing my thoughts down on paper. For in the very act of speaking, I seem to coincide with myself, that is, have an identity, in a way quite different from what happens when I write. Writing seems to rob me of my being, because there's a difference. I'm distancing myself. Writing's a second-hand form of communication. As Eagleton writes it, a pallid, mechanical transcript of speech. And this is why kids don't want to write. They want to text, and because it seems to have an immediacy. It's more spontaneous. It's less thoughtful. It's less contemplative. It's more sensation. It's immediate, and it's like a drug. They're chasing their identity and the expressions of themselves that the technology advances, and a sense of immediacy, while at the same time radically being subject to this loss of purpose and meaning and identity, which is giving rise to suicide, particularly amongst young women who are more socially conscious and more socially engaged. So social media does the exact opposite of what it claims to do. It radically desocializes them. The very immediacy that they long for, they don't get. So the vilification of writing in favor of voice in the Western conclusion in the Western tradition is the conclusion here. It's a very romantic conclusion, I think, by the way. Derrida said it was true of Western philosophy. It's not true of Western philosophy. It's true of post-romantic philosophy. And so he gets into this discussion, though, on phonocentricity and logocentricity, and gets into Derrida and his deconstruction. But for me, as I said, the fundamental problem, which began in the early 18th century, is we're not governing reality in accordance with God's revelation. We're using it in terms of our human understanding of the human thing that we use to describe the word, namely language. And the origin of language becomes all important then. And it infinitely problematizes human nature, because human nature is subject to existential considerations as opposed to those of being, which are eternal and allow for meaning and purpose and truth and beauty and goodness, etc. So it begins in the 18th century. At least the shift to look at human language is the source of this problem. So, and Eagleton will go on with this and says that any transcendental meaning is a fiction, though perhaps a necessary fiction. This is one consequence of the theory of language I've outlined. There is no concept which is not embroiled in an open-ended play of signification, shot through with the traces and fragments of other ideas. It is just that, Out of this play of signifiers, certain meanings are elevated by social ideologies to a privileged position, or made the centers around which other meanings are forced to turn. Now this is where Eagleton, the ideologue, comes in here. So if everything is an endless play of signifiers, and there's never a transcendental signifier, or signified, nonetheless we require certain transcendental signifiers, or to believe that they exist, like myself, like God. And he will listen to this, or he'll list them. Consider in our own society: freedom, the family, democracy, independence, authority, order, and so on. Sometimes such meanings are seen as the origin of all the others, the source from which they flow. But this, as we have seen, is a curious way of thinking, because for this meaning ever to have been possible, other signs must already have existed. It is difficult to think of an origin without wanting to go back beyond it. At other times, such meanings may be seen, but note that in Romanticism, there's always this tendency to go back to origins. We have to get to the origin. Always this trope of returning to origins. Wordsworth wants to go back to his childhood innocence. Darwin wants to go to the origin of the species. You got to go back to the beginning. And there's this always, we're going to defer back to that because that's how we will understand ourselves. And in terms of literature, the orphan will talk about his birth as a means of identifying who he is. He's a Cartesian orphan. And the genre of literature that ensues from this will be use the German phrase, a Bildungsroman. And Bildung here means to self-cultivate. It doesn't really have a good translation in English. It's not education, it's self-cultivation. Education is the old ideal. This is the self-directed form of education. Child-centered learning. Experiential learning. Bildung. And the Bildungsroman is always centered around a hero who's an orphan. It's the ideal model. It's the way we are to think of ourselves even when we're not orphans. Think of yourself without a parent. And if you can't, we'll help you do that by taking you away from your parents so that you can do this for yourself. And if your parents are opposing your self-identification, we're going to come in alongside you to help you be yourself. Right? So it's a very principled position. I think it's as bad and wrong as could be, but it's a very principled one. There is a logic to it. So Derrida labels metaphysical any such thought system which depends on unassailable foundations, a first principle, or an unimpeachable ground upon which a whole hierarchy of meanings may be constructed. And what they end up having is a binary structure to them. And the first principles are defined by what they exclude. So a male-dominated society, the male is the foundation principle that excludes women. The white excludes the black, the Christian excludes all the other religions, etc. All these, the binary, because within the binary there's one that's privileged and has the status within the hierarchy, and then it's the product of social critical theories to undo the binary and to take what was low and put it on top, etc. And that will extend itself not only to people, but then even to conceptualizations of being and non-being, or good and evil. What was good is now going to be determined evil, and what was evil is going to be called good, because it was a hierarchical, and we're going to disrupt the hierarchy and the binary nature of it. This is what's made of Derrida. This is, as we said, why Derrida is so popular. Even if they don't like the implications of what Derrida says, because if the implication, what Derrida says is true, it will also apply to their own assertions of meaning and hierarchy. Always. But that's the post-structuralist shift. And let me give the summary here, because I think the summary is at the bottom of 115. Structuralism was generally satisfied if it could carve up a text into binary oppositions: high, low, light, dark, nature, culture, and so on, and expose the logic of their working. Deconstruction tries to show how such oppositions, in order to hold themselves in place, are sometimes betrayed into inverting or collapsing themselves. That's what Derrida did last time. Or need to banish to the text margins certain niggling details which can be made to return and plague them. Derrida's own typical habit of reading is to seize on some apparently peripheral fragment in the work. It's true. A footnote or a recurrent minor term or image or a casual allusion, and work it tenaciously through to the point where it threatens to dismantle the oppositions which govern the whole text. He tries to show how texts embarrass themselves and never actually articulate what they intend to. But post-structuralism will have a surplus of meaning. And the advent of writing is a challenge to the very idea of structure. Because a structure always presumes a center and a coherence, a fixed principle, a hierarchy of meanings, and a solid foundation. And it is just these notions which the endless differing and deferring of writing throws into question. So we move from structuralism to post-structuralism, and that includes Derrida, but it's also going to include a couple of writers that we're about to look at, Michel Foucault being chief among them. But we could also look at the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. We could look at the feminist philosopher Julia Kristeva. And Foucault is not mentioned in Eagleton's work, but we'll talk about him on the course because Foucault is the most important intellectual in the academy in the past 40 years on the basis of citations. Foucault is endlessly cited. Foucault, 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 Foucault. You'd say, why is he so important? And I couldn't have addressed that before this point on the course. Now we can. But I'll leave it off with that because I think we've done enough.